Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 305, The History of Jewish Circumcision. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we have reached the midway point in the month of December, and you know what that means. People start thinking about their end-of-year donations. And I always wonder if maybe I forgot to mention that Judaism Unbound is a nonprofit organization. And we really are trying to pilot a model where we don't ask for a lot. We would be thrilled if everybody who's out there listening to episodes of Judaism Unbound would consider contributing just $1 for every episode of Judaism Unbound that you've listened to, and if you've interacted with some of our other stuff over the past year, Jewish Live, the Onion Yeshiva. So the way to do that, and we would really appreciate it, is if you would go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate and just make a small contribution. That could be $18, it could be $50, and you can also sign up to make recurring monthly donations. $4 or $5 a month would really track our 4 or 5 episodes of Judaism Unbound that we put out every month. We haven't missed a single Friday in over 300 episodes, and we're really proud of that, and we're only able to do that because of your support. So thank you so much for supporting our work, supporting Judaism Unbound, and supporting our continuing ability to dig into these issues that are at the heart of what Judaism has been and will be. And today is no exception to that. We are still in our series exploring circumcision. And today we are talking not with somebody who is an advocate on one side or another. Our guest today is an academic who studies about the history of circumcision. And we think that no matter what position you take on this issue or any issue, it's great to try to learn just the facts, like to really understand what that history is. Our guest today is Shaye J.D. Cohen. He is the Nathan Littauer Professor of Hebrew Literature and Philosophy in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. That is one of the oldest professorships of Jewish studies in the United States. He has rabbinical ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary and also served there as the dean of the graduate school and as a professor of Jewish history. Shaye Cohen is an expert on the boundary between Jews and Gentiles and between Judaism and its surrounding cultures in ancient times in antiquity. He has written many books and articles on these subjects. His book that's most germane to the topics that we're talking about today is called Why Aren't Jewish Women Circumcised? Gender and Covenant in Judaism. We're actually not talking about that question today. We're just talking about a history of Jewish circumcision, which he has at the beginning of that book. He is currently nearing completion on a 3-volume work that is an annotation of the Mishnah, the first major book of Rabbinic Judaism, and we can't wait to get our hands on it. So we're really thrilled to be able to welcome such a distinguished expert in the history of circumcision to this conversation and to this thought process that we're going through, which we're sure is going to add to our understanding of this complex issue. Shaye Cohen, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Glad to be here.
So when we jump into this question about the sources and the origins of Jewish circumcision, I think it's a complex question to say, where's the beginning, where's the origin? We'll cut at that in different ways, but I thought maybe we could just start with the origin as you tend to encounter it in the Bible, which is the story of Abraham's circumcision in Genesis 17. Could you tell us a little bit about how you read that story and the significance of circumcision to the biblical, I guess I should say to the biblical editor, because as you write in your book, there are other origins, and I want to get into some of the more granular origins of that story, but at least as we encounter it as a finished work, what do you see the biblical editor as seeing as the significance of that circumcision of Abraham?
What's lurking behind all these circumcision passages, especially Genesis 17, is the notion of a covenant. So there's something that binds Abraham and his descendants, on the one hand, to God. And we call that a covenant. Covenant is a fancy word. You could say a contract, you could say a deal, an alliance, an arrangement. But we have two covenants between God and Abraham in the book of Genesis. Two covenants. One is Genesis chapter 15, where we have the so-called covenant between the sections. There, something is cut, but what's cut is an animal. The animal is cut, and then the two parties to the contract, namely God and Abraham, march through the severed bits of the animal as a way of solemnizing the covenant. That's covenant number one. Covenant number one in Genesis chapter 15 seems to be a covenant based entirely on genealogy, i.e., God talks to Abraham, Abraham and his descendants. These things will happen to them. They'll be enslaved for 400 years. They'll come back. They'll conquer the land. That happens to Abraham and his descendants. That's chapter 15. Chapter 17, Genesis, gives us what seems to be an alternative version. In other words, it's also a covenant. It's also about God and Abraham and Abraham's descendants. It's also about inheriting the land, the land of Israel. Except now, instead of cutting an animal, as we did in 15, now we're cutting off the foreskin from the males. That's now the way of solemnizing this covenant. Now, for those of us who read these chapters, chapter 15 seems completely bizarre. What does it mean you're slicing animals in half and marching through the severed bits, the severed carcass? That seems like a very odd way to solemnize a covenant. And on the other hand, chapter 17, another very odd way to solemnize a covenant is to ask all the men to cut off the foreskin. That also seems to us to be sort of inexplicable, odd, and indeed, neither 15 nor 17 explains anything. It simply says what to do. Abraham, do this, chapter 15. Abraham, do that, chapter 17. Abraham, this is for your descendants and your family line, chapter 15. Abraham, this is for your descendants who cut off their foreskin on the eighth day, that they're the ones who will inherit the land. We have then these two chapters in equipoise of two different versions of the covenant between God and Abraham.
So if I'm not mistaken, I think I got this from your book on Jewish circumcision, that 2 points about this particular story. One is that, what does cutting have to do with a covenant? And you write that it's kind of a Hebrew version of, like, in English, we have to cut a deal. In Hebrew, there's lechrot brit, which also basically means to cut a covenant. And so there's some concept linguistically, and maybe it actually comes from an actual cutting. I don't know where the English exactly comes from, but that cutting is actually somehow related to covenant making. And then specifically the question of why are we cutting the penis, that sort of has to do with that the covenant here is particularly about being fruitful. And so that is what would make most sense. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Very briefly, because I'm not sure of the answer. Genesis 15 has us cutting animals in half. That strikes us as really very odd way to solemnize a deal. But we do find it elsewhere in the ancient Near East. That seems to be a standard, not the standard, but a standard way of verifying signing on the dotted line. Would you please sign here, please? Take out your stamp and stamp here. Cut the carcass in half, right? It seems to be a standard way of making a deal. As far as cutting the foreskin, lots of cultures in the ancient Near East do that. Some of them still do that because Muslims do it. So cutting the foreskin is a standard, what word shall I use? Procedure, celebration, something in the ancient Near East. Ancient Israel, as far as we know, was the only one to do two things. One, the circumcision takes place on the eighth day of life. It's not done as a puberty ritual. It's not done as a marriage ritual. It's done on an 8-day-old infant. So obviously it's not giving consent. It obviously does not know what's going on, but it's something that's done to the infant, right? No one else did that, as far as we know. And second of all, ancient Israel were the only ones who took this idea of cutting the foreskin, which is widely practiced, but now investing it with covenantal value, right? Seeing that somehow through the act of circumcision, we are bound to our God. Now our God is bound to us. So we promise to obey his demands, and he promises to take care of us, bring us a mighty people, conquer the land, and be fertile and multiply. Right? That's the deal. No one else did that as far as we know. Cutting the foreskin, plenty. Cutting the foreskin with all this covenantal, contractual, mutual obligation stuff, that's ancient Israel. Now you're going to ask me, well, why did they do that? Or where did this idea come from? What possessed them to come up with this understanding? That's where I said before, I simply don't know.
So, sticking on the subject of origins, I mean, we've looked at Genesis 17 as the first story of circumcision that we encounter, but there's this other story later in Genesis about the daughter of Jacob, and she encounters a young man named Shechem, and he either rapes her or in some fashion they perceive it as rape.
He takes her, whatever that means.
Yes, so he takes her, and that has been understood to be a rape. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But in any event, the brothers, the other sons of Jacob, some of them are aggrieved about it, and they say that you have to marry our sister, but you can't marry our sister if you are an uncircumcised. And they insist that Shechem and the whole city circumcise themselves. But in your book, you talk about how if they're just circumcising themselves and they're not converting to Judaism, there was no concept of that in those days, and they're not really becoming part of this covenant, then what does it really mean? And maybe it's some kind of mark of tribal identity or some other just kind of a marker. And when I was reading that, I was feeling like, that kind of makes more sense as an earliest origin of why there might be a certain practice in a certain tribe that says, hey, we all do this. I mean, we see other peoples that get tattoos or whatever it might be, that this is how we identify that we're one another. That almost felt to me like the more ancient origin story. And then, at some later time, there was religious significance or theological significance placed on it. So I'm wondering if what we know about that and what we can speculate about the true origins of circumcision within what we think of as the Jewish world.
How we attack this question depends on how we read the Torah, how we understand the Torah. So if you are a traditionalist, that is to say, you believe that God wrote the Torah, God gave it to Moses, and Moses brought the Torah to the people of Israel, and the Torah that we have today is the very same Torah that Moses got from God, right? If that's your approach, then you sort of take everything as factual. God spoke to Abraham, and we have a covenant of the circumcision in Genesis chapter 17. Chapter 34, we have a story in which apparently the covenantal value is not there, but that seems to be part of the story, that the brothers used circumcision merely as a way of weakening their opponents so as to kill them. Then we have the fragmentary piece in Exodus 4 about with Zipporah, and you are the bridegroom of blood to me, an extraordinarily cryptic little piece with something to do with circumcision saving from death. Either Moses or his son was threatened with death, and circumcision saved him. So that's yet another meaning that's built in right at the very beginning. It's in the Torah, right? Now we learn that if Israelites want to eat the Paschal sacrifice, they need to be circumcised. What's the connection between circumcision and the Paschal sacrifice? Well, the Torah doesn't say, but again, I'm just working on the assumption that we have the covenantal value is already there. Passover is sort of the foundation festival of our people. So the circumcision goes with saving from death, like in Exodus 4. The destroyer came around at night and killed the firstborn, but not the Israelite firstborn because they were circumcised. So the circumcision and the blood of circumcision are somehow saving. And all these meanings are all blended together. And then we have, last but not least, Leviticus chapter 12, where a woman after birth, she's impure for 7 days. And on the 8th day, if he's a boy, he gets circumcised. Well, it seems to suggest there's some notion of purity and impurity going on here. So if you're reading it straight, flat, well, we have then various voices to be sure. We have covenant over here, Passover over there, Genesis 34, a tribal mark, right? So you would simply say, these are all true, right? I'm not going to try to sort them out for you. I would say, if you're reading it as a traditionalist, all of this comes to you as sort of as a smorgasbord of possibilities, but all on one serving tray. If you're a modern Bible scholar, MBS, or an academic student of the Bible, then your approach is completely different. Then your approach is to say, my goal is to arrange these things in some sort of chronological developmental sequence, where I can sort of make plausible conjectures, because all they are, just conjectures. We don't have actual hard data. But I can make a plausible little conjectures. I can reconstruct, right, how these meanings expand, how these meanings change, how these meanings in different contexts meant different things to different people. by that criterion, if you're a traditionalist, Genesis 17 is the beginning of the story. But if you're a modern Bible academic scholar, then Genesis 17 is not the beginning of the circumcision story. It's somewhere in the middle, or perhaps the end of it, in the sense that all these other things had preceded it until something happened, probably in the Babylonian exile, after the temple has been destroyed in 587 BCE. May I remind you, the Babylonians did not circumcise their sons, right? So maybe there we understand why circumcision emerges along with some other laws in the Torah, notably Shabbat, notably the food laws. You might say, well, these now come as a package, as a way for Israelites to affirm their identity, right, in a context which is very threatening to their identity. And now circumcision emerges as covenantal. Beforehand, there was this, it was that, there was this, it was that. But now here, in this context, now becomes covenantal. So the covenantal meaning of Genesis 17 and this reading is not the beginning of the circumcision story. It's more or less the climactic ending of the circumcision story, because now circumcision has a value it never had before. And the way the narrator tells the story is to put it back into the time of Abraham, but that's actually not the true historical sequence.
You said very quickly, and I want to make sure it sort of hits people. You brought up Exodus. You brought up Exodus chapter 4 with Zipporah, and you also brought up that story of the 10th plague. And
right.
And I think for a lot of people, some people have never thought about circumcision in the Bible, and they don't know where it comes up. Other people, they might know the Abraham story, but they'd be like, Exodus also, like you're bringing it up. And Zipporah, like she literally circumcises her and Moses' son. Straightforward connection. But what you said about the 10th plague is less obvious for folks. And so I'd love for you to sort of dwell in Exodus for a bit and talk about like what's happening there, because in what you wrote, you talk a little bit about how there seems to be almost like a life-saving potential that arises in circumcision. Yes. In both of those situations, with Zipporah and then with the 10th plague, although in some different ways. And so I'd love to hear a little more there. And I know that in what you write, it sort of connects to some later texts that are going to come. And I'd love to invite you to start taking us there as we sort of move into the next stage of our conversation.
Another complicated question, full of possible tangents and digressions and so on, the best kind of question. So the fancy schmancy word I want to introduce into the conversation is apotropaic. So apotropaic is a Greek word, and it means averting, turning aside, and as a transitive, turning aside something. In this case, turning aside some danger. So circumcision in chapter 17 is not, in Genesis 17, is not depicted as apotropaic, right? But circumcision is depicted as apotropaic in the context of Zipporah in Exodus chapter 4. Somebody's in danger. Either Moses or Moses' son is in danger. And Zipporah, by circumcising her son and doing some odd ritual which is not explained really in the text, she is able to save him from death. But the act of circumcision is a salvific, salvation-bringing, apotropaic, warding away danger ritual. And in context, I am convinced that there has to be some connection between where it's found in the book of Exodus and the story we're about to read. We're about to read the so-called 10 plagues, and the 10th of them, of course, is the death of the firstborn, where God lets loose the destroyer. In Hebrew is hamashchit. God lets loose the destroyer among the Egyptians, kill off the firstborn. But the Israelites are saved. Now, how are the Israelites saved? Here I would trot out, once again, circumcision. And I realize when I look at the laws of the Passover in in Exodus 13, I see there that you need to be circumcised to eat of the Paschal sacrifice. What's the connection? Answer, the only connection I can think of is that the blood of the sacrificial lamb is also apotropaic, just like the blood of Zipporah's sacrifice. The blood saves from death, wards away that mysterious anger of God being angry in Exodus chapter 4 with Zipporah, and it wards away the mashchit who is out destroying the firstborn, but not the firstborn of the Israelites. Why not? Because we've been circumcised. So they've been protected by the circumcision. Now, this is how I read the story, understand the connection between this obscure episode over here and this obscure law over there, which wants to connect circumcision with the Paschal sacrifice, which otherwise I cannot explain what the connection is. Now, the later rabbinic midrashim are rabbinic retellings of scripture, very often in some very elaborate way. They do some absolutely wondrous things to this whole sequence of events in the book of Exodus. One of the wondrous things that they do is, according to the book of Exodus, the Israelites daub the doorposts with blood. They're using the blood of the Paschal lamb. And the blood from the Paschal lamb, they're going to daub on the doorposts, and it is that blood on the doorposts of their houses, their habitations, and it is that blood which keeps away the mashchit. Now, you might say it keeps away the mashchit just as a form of address. The destroyer needs to know which house is a Jewish house. So he sees the blood on the doorpost and says, oh, that's a Jewish house. I'll go to the next one. You could argue it means something as mechanical as that the destroyer needs to know which house is a Jewish house, so he should skip that one. However, the rabbinic midrash reads that very differently. No, the blood has power, like circumcision. The blood has power to save you from death. To save the Israelite firstborn is the power of the Paschal lamb, blood of the Paschal lamb. But then the rabbinic midrash does something even more extraordinary. The blood on the doorpost is not just the blood of the Paschal lamb, it's also the blood of the circumcision. That the Israelites were lined up to circumcise themselves right before the Paschal lamb was going to be consumed. In order to eat the Paschal lamb, they need to be circumcised. Therefore, the midrash says, they probably were lined up the day before Passover to get themselves circumcised. So the circumcision blood is the blood that's put on the doorpost. And that is so far from what's going on in the Torah that you got to say the rabbis are getting this from somewhere. They got some kind of theology of circumcision blood that's coming from somewhere, and they are running with it. But that's not in the Torah. That's later rabbinic elaborations of the story in the Torah. So there's one more thing in the Torah we need to mention, which is found in Deuteronomy, which is the notion of a spiritual circumcision, a circumcision of the heart. That appears twice in Deuteronomy, and that language also will appear in some of the prophets. And that will loom large in later Christian reading of the Torah, where Christians will argue that's the circumcision God really wants, is metaphorical circumcision, not real circumcision, to which Jews will reply, maybe God wants both.
Am I correct in remembering that there is that the procedure of circumcision was made more extreme, maybe in the Maccabee period or maybe a little after, because when the Hellenists, because when the Greeks or the Greek culture was dominant in the land of Israel, there was basically gymnasiums where people would do sports in the nude, and there was a concern among Jews that they didn't want to appear circumcised, and so people were actually kind of trying to reverse the circumcision, so which you could do because only a small amount of the foreskin was cut off, so they made a change that you have to cut it all off so that basically it would become impossible to reverse the circumcision. So circumcision as we know it today is actually not really the same as the circumcision of the Torah.
So you're absolutely right that there are traces in our sources that during either during Second Temple times, the 2nd century BC, or perhaps into Roman times in the 2nd century CE, right? We have Jews who are trying very hard to disguise their circumcision. Now, how do you disguise your circumcision? Well, if there's enough skin left behind, you could sort of take that skin that's left over and kind of stretch it down and pull on it and stretch it so that it'll sort of look like it was never cut or trimmed to begin with. If you saw the movie Europa, you'll see this, because the movie Europa, this is an unpaid endorsement, right? It's all about circumcision. And the whole story of the movie is how a young man was growing up in Hitler's Germany and is desperate to hide his circumcision because anybody sees it, they'll know instantly he was born a Jew. And therefore, if anybody sees his circumcision, it's death. It's really basically death. And somehow he survives the war. But there again, he tries all kinds of things to hide his circumcision, including this. But it's very difficult for him to do it, or for any of us moderns to do it, because, as you said, our circumcision is more total, more complete than other ways of doing circumcision. Now, it seems in antiquity there were different ways of doing circumcision. The details we don't have. We don't have archaeological data, obviously, but we do know from various sources that there were different ways of doing it. And by the time you get to the 2nd century CE, the rabbis, as you said, are endorsing a mode of cutting off the skin. So it's not just the skin, but also the membrane underneath. And once you cut off the membrane underneath, there's really nothing left to stretch, nothing left to pull. So at that point, it becomes very difficult to hide your circumcision.
Let's shuttle forward a little in history. Let's do it. So I have 2 prongs on that are not really of, I don't know, they're 2 separate categories, but I'm going to ask them as one. One is, listeners of the show will know this. You don't necessarily. I'm a big Jubilees guy. I don't know that that's a category of people out there, but I'm a big Jubilees guy. The Book of Jubilees weighs in, to put it lightly, on this question of circumcision. Yeah. And it may surprise people, given my approaches to the world, how it weighs in. But it does weigh in, and I'd love to hear from you a little bit about that, because chronologically, we're sort of around there. And then the next stage chronologically would be, of course, the Mishnah and the Talmud. But I would love to hear from you, what happens next in the story? How does Jubilees, this book that didn't quite make it in, but does seem to have been authoritative for some groups of Jews, how does it tie to the question of circumcision? And then how in the Mishnah and Talmud does it take some next steps? Because, spoiler alert, it seems that people in the Talmud are all of a sudden saying, wow, circumcision is great and extraordinary. It's not just that we do it, like, it's super awesome. And I'm curious, what some of those texts are and how we got there.
Okay, so Book of Jubilees. Book of Jubilees is a fascinating book. So it is one of the books of the so-called pseudepigrapha, a loose collection of books that are not found in the Hebrew Bible, but are somehow come from the Jews of antiquity. They survive by various serpentine channels, in this case through the Ethiopic church, mostly. Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is an extraordinary book. And one of the things that make it extraordinary is its desire to separate through the negation. They're doing things wrong, stay away from them. They're doing things wrong, stay away from them. Don't do things this way, do things the right way. And these people are sinners and a bunch of no-goods. So that much of the rhetoric of the book is negative, or it's hostile. It's criticizing what other people are doing, right? And it's advocating that its way of understanding the Torah and of the laws is the only right way. And along the way, he talks about circumcision. This is inspired by Genesis chapter 34, to which we alluded to earlier. So in that context of reading the rape of Dinah and Dinah being taken by Shem, and then her brothers coming to rescue her, rescue is a quotation, air quotes, because I don't know whether she wanted to be rescued or we don't. Anyway, now I'm digressing. Back to where I was. So while the author of Jubilees is rewriting the story of Genesis 34, he has a disquisition on circumcision, because after all, that circumcision looms large in that story. So there he discusses again, he seems to suggest in a very cryptic verse that there are Jews out there who are going to do circumcision wrong. So if I understand that passage correctly, the author of Jubilees is engaged in a polemic with fellow Jews about how to do circumcision. How much skin do we cut off and how do we do it? Unfortunately, there are no diagrams, there are no surgical manuals, there are no detailed descriptions. But there I see there is something there among the other arguments that are going on in that book is this one, right? How to do circumcision. And I think by the time you get to the rabbis 2-3 centuries later, right, it's clear that we sort of cut off the skin and also the membrane underneath. It's actually surprising how little the Mishnah has about circumcision. The Mishnah, in case you'd like a refresher, right? The Mishnah is the first rabbinic book. It is the foundation stone of rabbinic law, the foundation stone of the Talmud, the foundation stone of what we call halacha. It is in many ways the foundation stone of rabbinic Judaism. That's the Mishnah. And go to your local bookstore come the fall, and there should be in shrink wrap for you 3 fat volumes of the new annotated translation of the Mishnah. I won't tell you what its list price is going to be because you'll die of shock. the Mishnah says remarkably little about circumcision. Fundamentally, one chapter in Tractate Shabbat. They talk about the laws of circumcision, and there's another chapter in Nedarim where they have the rhetoric of praise. The passage in Shabbat tells us a very important lesson. That is to say, A, you should prepare everything in advance for circumcision on Shabbat. In other words, you should get everything ready to go. So when we minimize the violation of Shabbat in order to do a circumcision on Shabbat, there's an 8-day-old baby on Shabbat, we will circumcise the baby on the 8th day, but we try to prepare in advance whatever we can so as to minimize violation. Okay, that's a very interesting idea, especially the idea that if there's an 8-day-old baby on Shabbat, we circumcise the baby anyway. Circumcision pushes aside Shabbat.
And the idea being that there are certain things relating to circumcisions, like cutting and carrying things to the house, et cetera, that you wouldn't be allowed to do on Shabbat for any other reason.
Right, but we do them anyway. The circumcision overrides Shabbat. That's a very important principle that we learned from that chapter in Tractate Shabbat. I say it's very important because there were Jews who said, no, it doesn't set aside Shabbat. Okay, but the rabbis do, and to this very day, we will circumcise the baby on the 8th day. Again, trying to prepare in advance whatever can be prepared in advance so as to minimize violation of Shabbat. The other important chapter in the Nedarim is full of rhetorical praise for circumcision in an extraordinary way. Great the circumcision because. And they have a whole page full of praises of circumcision. Now, it's interesting that whole long page full of praises of circumcision like this, I've often wondered to myself, what's bugging them? They don't do praises of other mitzvot like this. This is unusual. You don't say, great is the mitzvah of eating matzah. No, you just go ahead and eat matzah. Great is the prohibition of eating food on Yom Kippur. No, you just fast on Yom Kippur. I don't need a whole praise of telling me how wonderful fasting on Yom Kippur is. So why do you have a whole page telling me, Tractate Nedarim, circumcision is great? So I often wondered and thought to myself, I'm not the first one to think of this, that maybe they're talking to someone. And they're talking to Pauline Christians who say that in Genesis 15, Abraham is called righteous. Abraham trusted in the Lord, and the Lord counted him for righteousness. So Paul quotes that in Galatians. Paul says, you see, you can be righteous before God and not be circumcised. So this happens in Genesis chapter 15, and circumcision is not until Genesis chapter 17. So here we have Abraham being hailed by God as righteous without circumcision. You see, says Paul and the early Christians, you don't need to be circumcised to be righteous. To my mind, that's what's lurking behind that passage in the Nedarim, this long passage full of this extraordinary hyperbolic praises of circumcision. Aside from that, the Mishnah has almost nothing to say about circumcision. You have to wait till you get to the Gemara, which repeats what we just said, but it's really the Midrash, the scriptural rereading, which now takes off. And I alluded to that earlier with reference to Birkat Eliezer and the circumcision blood. It's really the Midrashic retellings of circumcision that really develop the power that circumcision has in the Jewish psyche.
Other than Pauline Christians, which we should just sort of note, around the time that the Mishnah was codified, Christianity had not yet become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so Pauline Christians were kind of another small group that they knew of, that had relationships with them. I'm wondering, were there other groups of Jews? Is there any evidence that we have that there were other groups of Jews who might not have been circumcising, or we don't really have evidence one way or the other of that?
There is some evidence that some Hellenistic Jews, i.e. Greek-educated, Greek-speaking Jews who live among the Greeks, that some of them at least either try to commit epispasm, namely pulling down on the skin to hide their foreskin, or simply didn't circumcise. My evidence for that is from a famous passage in Philo on the migration of Abraham, chapter 89, where Philo is aware of the fact that there are some Jews who, he says, read the Torah metaphorically, read the Torah's commandments metaphorically. But Philo says the Torah, these commandments of the Torah should be read not only metaphorically, but also the letter and the spirit. They're both the metaphor as well as the content. We're supposed to observe both, says Philo. And he gives you a couple of examples of what people out there, whom we usually call extreme allegorists, right? These are Jews who take the Torah as allegory, symbol, metaphor, not literal. So apparently circumcision is on that little list of Philo in that passage, which seems to suggest there are Hellenistic Jews who are giving up on circumcision, perhaps because of the social shame it might bring in the gymnasium, or I don't know exactly what motives to impute to them, but certainly they saw that this was not something that would make them acceptable or admirable in Greek society. So I'm assuming that the Jews that the Mishnah Nedarim is talking to might not just be Christian, they might be Hellenized Jews.
So first a comment, I'm struck by what you said about all these statements about, oh, so holy is circumcision, and how that suggests that they're talking to somebody who might disagree. It reminds me of similar kinds of praise for like, oh, Song of Songs, the book is so holy, which, it's a book that's super sexual and raunchy, and seems like they're probably communicating under the surface like, you might not think it's holy, but it's actually holy. So it's an interesting phenomenon you're describing there.
So this is what I call the Harvard Divinity School method of reading ancient texts. If they're writing a polemic, or if it's an extreme version of something, it's the evidence for the opposite of what it said. If the rabbis are busy telling you how important circumcision is, it's because someone out there is telling you circumcision is not important.
So my next question, we're not going to be able to get through the rest of human history till now, unfortunately, but I am curious to fill in a little bit more of the chronology here by going forward beyond the Mishnah into the Talmud. And also what's funny about your chapter, you actually, it sort of starts recently and then shuttles us back. You start with a recent text or recent in the grand scheme, 440-year-old text.
16th century is not that recent.
Yeah, yesterday, but no, 16th century. You start with that, but I'm curious, like, just as we sort of tie a bow on the evolutions of circumcision over time, what happens next in the stages of the Talmud after the Mishnah, in some midrashes? Right. We actually got a sneak preview with the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, right. But what's next?
As far as I could tell, in the pre-rabbinic times, circumcision basically meant cutting off a piece of skin. Who cut off the piece of skin? How he, she, they cut off the piece of skin didn't seem to matter. What God wants is the foreskin to be removed. And as long as you remove it, you are following God's will. You're following God's command.
And indeed, Tzipporah, that early story, A, she's a woman, and B, she's not an Israelite.
There you go. So we can think of other examples, right, to demonstrate the rectitude of Professor Cohen's observation, right, that what matters is simply removing the piece of skin. Now, why did God want that piece of skin removed? I already told you I don't know, so don't ask me. Right? So God asked that the piece of skin be removed. By the time our sages get a hold of circumcision and start to do things with it, we all of a sudden realize that the sages introduce a completely new idea, not found anywhere, as far as I know, in pre-rabbinic texts. The idea that for a brit to be a brit, or to use, if I use this formulation, for a circumcision to be reckoned covenantal, then it needs to be done by a Jew with the proper intent. And if it's not done with the proper intent, then it doesn't count. It's not, quote, a real brit. So circumcision means cutting off a piece of skin, or what my formulation would be. Circumcision is cutting off a piece of skin, but for circumcision to become a brit, be endowed with covenantal value, right, then that requires the intention of the operator. And this you find in various places in the Talmud, and then it's everywhere. It's all over the place. So this is of some importance to Jews today, because some Jews choose to have their children circumcised, right? But the circumcision may not be, halachically speaking, may not be a brit. I was commenting, this is a step that the rabbis took, and it is consonant with many other laws in which the rabbis also introduced the notion of intention. Right? This is a common motif, and everybody notices this in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, both, right? That intentionality affects the quality of the result of the act. Another thing that the rabbis do in the centuries after the Mishnah and the Talmud, right, is to give the circumcision a ceremonial set. So it becomes a holy act, the davar shabik dusha, we might say in rabbinic idiom, right? It becomes a holy act, usually performed with a minyan, sometimes performed in shul or a synagogue, not always, it can be done in a private house, but you would have a minyan. There are benedictions that are recited in connection with and various prayers. None of that was known before the rabbis came along and sanctified the ritual of circumcision. And of course, that's what we have today. There's one more thing I would emphasize, I think the rabbis come up with, which is by the time you get to the Zohar, so the Jewish mystical texts in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, right, the Jewish mystical texts, we have the idea that Brit Milah, circumcision, is, well, I describe in the book, is something like baptism. If you got it, you're a Jew. If you don't got it, you're either not a Jew at all or you're not exactly the right kind of Jew, because without circumcision, you are not part of the holy people. Now, the Zohar has this idea that circumcision has some mysterious transformative power. Maybe this is going back ultimately to Tzipora and the mysterious blood. I don't know exactly, right? But the idea then that the transformative power of circumcision is what makes you a Jew.
So I just want to pick up on what you're saying about the Zohar, which I'll note for our listeners that Zohar, the book of the main book of Jewish mysticism, is not necessarily accepted as definitive by everybody. I mean, just because something's in the Zohar doesn't mean today we have to all agree with it. Unlike maybe what some would say about the Torah. Of course, others would say that's also not true about the Torah. But in any event, I wanted to go back to the Gemara, to the Talmud, and to say, like, this idea that the Zohar is introducing, that the bris, the circumcision, is what makes you a Jew. But we know that the Talmud has certain categories of people who are clearly acknowledged to be Jews who are not circumcised. For example, people whose brothers died from a circumcision. If that happened, I think, twice, then the parents don't have to circumcise their children anymore. And there's no hint that those children are not Jewish in any way, shape, or form. I'm wondering if there are other things in the Gemara like that are worth noting before we move ahead. And also just what do we make of the idea that this much later work, the Zohar, is introducing a concept that is utterly irreconcilable with what the Talmud says?
So the key point to keep in mind here is distinction in genre. The halacha, the law, is one thing. Mysticism or Kabbalah is another. So on the halachic side, of course, a man does not have to be circumcised in order to be a Jew. You can be born a Jew, and you are a Jew. And of course, as you grow up, you should have yourself, if your parents were malefactors and never got you circumcised, well, then at some point as you grow up, you should get yourself circumcised. The commandment will devolve upon you.
According to halakha, basically.
According to halakha. This is the legal tradition. Jewish law, Jewish normative law, clearly understands Jewishness as being separate from the issue of circumcision. Circumcision permits you to do certain things. For example, eat of the Paschal sacrifice. Well, we don't have a Paschal sacrifice anymore, so that's an easy one. Okay, but circumcision is simply what affects your status vis-a-vis X, Y, or Z. But as far as the overall picture, of course you're Jewish. You're born from a Jewish mother, then of course you are Jewish. What the Zohar is doing is in the Kabbalistic tradition. Here they can talk in a very different way. This is most extraordinarily interesting in passages which discuss what do you do if, heaven forbid, the baby dies before the 8th day? Well, on the legal tradition, there's nothing to do. Baby wasn't 8 days old. The commandment of circumcision doesn't kick in until the 8th day. If you die on day 5, there's nothing to talk about. It's like asking the baby who's 5 days old to eat matzah. I don't know, you don't do it. You're not doing mitzvah yet. However, the power of circumcision was so great that people felt we can't bring this child, bury him in a Jewish cemetery unless he's been circumcised. Right? We need to move the foreskin so that when there is resurrection of the dead, this child will join his fellow Jews and participate in the resurrection. Now, I would say that's a profound idea, We find that idea in various Cohenic materials and analogous ideas in the Zohar, though I can't remember now if that's exact laws in the Zohar, but that same kind of thinking is found in the Zohar, where I would say it's like baptism for Christians. You want to be a Christian, that's fine, but you got to be baptized. If you're not baptized, you're not a member of the church. You want to be a Jew, you got to get circumcision. If you don't got circumcision, you're just not a member. That is not the legal tradition. That is a tradition that comes out of popular piety and then into the Zohar and the mystical tradition.
So we are closing out our conversation, and just for those who have taken in your wisdom and all the texts you've cited from different eras and are just struggling to keep track of everything, what are just some general trajectories you can identify from where circumcision was in the Bible to where it is to today? We haven't talked much about today, and I know that circumcision, of course, is still a ritual out there, and I'd love to hear just your reflections on how this evolved over the many, 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 many generations and where it leaves us now.
So my argument in the book is that circumcision has had a particularly rich history, and it's still an ongoing history. We're not finished yet, in which new meanings are introduced, in which old meanings get reinterpreted. And even if the actual procedure may have changed somewhat, but no less important is that the meaning of the procedure has changed a lot. That on many crucial elements, they're simply not there in the Torah yet, and they will be introduced over the following centuries. And even something that is in the Torah, for example, Tzipora and circumcising somebody to save his life, even when something is in the Torah, right, it gets new meanings as it gets reinterpreted over time. In that sense, I think this is a good example of what I would call to be the history of Judaism, that we have here a constant interplay between doing things as we've always done them, on the one hand, versus, on the other hand, we have new novel meanings, perhaps new procedures, but we certainly have new meanings that are introduced into our trunk, Judaism, which we have a storage trunk, which we keep throwing stuff into it. We very rarely throw things out of it. We generally just keep adding things to it as we invest new meanings and new understandings of why we do what we do. In that sense, this is a particularly good and particularly rich example. So among the things that we discussed, the idea that this has sacramental value, that you really need circumcision to be a Jew. Well, that's the legal tradition would frown on that formulation, but the popular tradition, I think, understands it that way, which explains why Jews are still doing circumcision. Reform Jews are very happy to give up the laws of kashrut, but they're not happy to give up circumcision because there's a sense that, you really want to be a real Jew and you're a man, you really got to be circumcised. I think there is still that view out there, in spite of the fact that there are lots of voices nowadays, contrary, telling us that we should stop circumcising our sons, they should remain intact, which is an argument that has a certain amount of power. No question it has power. But on the other hand, I don't think that argument is going to win because we still have this inherited legacy of 2,000 plus years of thinking, developing, investing, searching out new ways of understanding what circumcision means. And that's what we're still doing.
Thank you so much, Shaye Cohen, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thank you, guys. And keep up the good work.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We've got one more episode that's just Dan and I next week that is closing out this unit on circumcision and alternatives to it. And we definitely invite you to listen to that. And of course, send us thoughts, questions, whatever you've got via email or just through our various social media channels and all of that. So the ways to be in touch with us are all of the following. First, our Facebook and Twitter and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, our email addresses, dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We also greatly appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.